Welcome, Carl.
Greetings, Michael. What is this episode? I think it's episode 712.
We are at a cool 25.
25.
Nice round number. We are a quarter of the way to our 100th episode.
That's exactly right. We'll see if we make it that long.
I've got faith. People are listening to the podcast. We're getting more feedback. We're getting like cool reviews on iTunes. So like we are arriving.
Hey, let me just real quickly get something off my chest. Like, I saw some review in one of these like industry magazines about your, like, everywhere I go, how come it's your like it was Kitces, and I feel a little, can we even now see people are gonna know that I feel a little bad. It's Kitces' podcast where he interviews Carl. What do we do?
That's flattering to you. You're the interviewee, you're the subject matter expert. I'm the poor communicating idiot who asks you all the questions to learn and glean for all of us. Like, this is flattering to you.
It is. I
You are the subject matter expert here.
So I am actually thrilled to be a guest on your podcast. Thank you for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you as a guest on our podcast, but sure, let's run with it. So like, kind of speaking of this theme of these conversations, our last episode, and a couple of these that we've done around just having these difficult client conversations, and which I think is like your gift. You've been incredibly well received by all the folks that have been listening. And so we did this conversation last week or 2 weeks ago around like talking clients down. We've had the like talk them off the ledge when they're freaking out. We did the talking them back when they're overly enthusiastic. Like, I just heard Bitcoin's going to the moon. I heard like gold's going to the moon. I want to buy these things and put a lot of money because I think I'm going to make $1 zillion, and like pulling clients back in that, what you call the overconfidence conversation. But we got some recent good conversation and feedback around this of sort of the alternative version, I think, of even those conversations, which is the client that maybe wants to put like everything in Bitcoin or everything in gold. And it's not because they think it's going to the moon, like the next hot investment. It's because they think everything else is going to go down the tubes. Like the government's going to destroy the dollar, so we have to buy Bitcoin. The economy is going to collapse. I have to put all my stuff into gold. It's sort of like I'm afraid we might have to hide in the bunker with the guns and the gold. And like, I don't want to make light of that. I mean, we see it across some clients from time to time that just are really anxious about this. And to me, it's a different, well, I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's a different kind of conversation than just the market's going down. It's a bear market. I'm freaking out. Like, I know how to get through some of those. Like, let's get back to your goals, and we can pull out the charts of like, yeah, markets pull back, but here's how they work in the long run. But when someone just is like questioning the entire foundation of the economic system, and that's the conversation that you've got to have now. How do you talk people back that want to be in this like hunker down in the bunker kind of portfolio? How do you have those conversations?
That's super interesting. It's interesting because of how long that's been going on. And I was just thinking, like, do I feel like that's increasing? And I would have to say, I feel like this is getting brought up more often than I can remember, but it's not new, right? Like, it feels like we've been having these kind of conversations for a while. And
I mean, I do feel like there was a change, I guess, basically since the financial crisis. I mean, I try to remember back for like first 10 years of my career in the 2000s. And I mean, we'd had our bear market, we had the tech crash, we had the recession after 9/11. The market went down a bunch, but it wasn't the same kind of environment. Like, I don't think anybody was questioning the soundness of the economic system. It was just like, geez, markets went up for 20 years in the 80s and 90s, and that tech crash sure sucked. But people bounced back pretty fast. Since the financial crisis, I feel like these, we're blowing up the dollar. The Fed's going to bring the system down. First it was gold, then it was Bitcoin. Now it's gold and Bitcoin. Like, just these discussions of, I guess, to the core, like, I'm losing faith in the economic system.
Yeah.
So why am I investing with you?
Yeah, no, I think that's the right way to put it, like faith, right? Like, this whole system is a story, and it's only as good as the faith we have in the story, right? Like, collectively, that we've all agreed that these things are going to work. And what's happened since the financial crisis, and even like the WeWork story recently, is an interesting example of just seeing, like, wait, maybe some of these stories weren't true, right? Like, weren't what we thought. So yeah, I think that's coming up more and more. So let's just dive into it a bit, because I also find, like, advisors themselves are often pretty prone to this too, because we spend a lot of time relatively analytical often, right? Spend a lot of time kind of digging into these things. We might be some of the few people who would be interested in reading a book about the global financial system, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is a problem, and I think it's a problem internally. It certainly was a challenge for me. So let's talk about it a little bit. So let's take it from the perspective of a client. Like, a client comes in and says this kind of stuff, and they point to some really reasonable research around it, even. Like, given the intertubes and the problem with confirmation bias, that I can find somebody somewhere that thinks, and I can actually probably find on this subject, I can find some people who are relatively reasonable, saying, hey, there's some big risks here that we're not thinking about. So how do we invest, and even broader, like, how do we have the conversation with clients, but also how do we build businesses around it? And I believe this points to one of the fundamental challenges, right? Like, in the end, we have to help people make mission critical decisions in the face of irreducible uncertainty. Like, we're not sure. There's a reason there's an equity premium. Like, stocks have always done better than, there's a reason beyond just short-term volatility, right? Because there's like risk there, and in all of its forms. So I think to have this conversation and to operate as a planner or an advisor that helps people make decisions about how they invest their money, you've got to make some fundamental assumptions, right? And these assumptions, you can rely on the weighty evidence of history for these assumptions, depending on how far you want to go back in terms of history. But certainly the last, whatever we're at, like 90, 95 years of equity market research, we can say, based on the weighty evidence of history, I think to operate and have this conversation we're going to get to with clients, we've got to make an assumption. The equity markets, the declines in the equity markets are temporary and the advance is permanent, right? That over long periods of time, and I think we'd all safely say those periods of time need to be, like, we sometimes think 3 or 5 years. No, they need to
be 10 or 15 years. Yep.
Decade or two, that over reasonable periods of time, reasonably long periods of time, you can have an assurance that equities are going to do better than fixed income, and fixed income is going to do better than cash. If you're not going to make that, if you're not okay with that assumption, I don't know how to operate. You know what I mean? Like, anything that deviates from that assumption means you're deviating from the weighty evidence of history, and you're now the assumer.
And is that literally how you would start framing this conversation up with the client? Like, hey, I just want to talk about some fundamental assumptions about how markets and economies work, and I just want to make sure we're on the same page about this. Because if we're not, that's the conversation we're going to have first. Like, over reasonable periods of time, equities will do better than fixed income. At some point, the economy grows and the rising tide lifts all boats, and that fixed income does something better than cash. And that's just the fundamental, like, reward for taking the risk of bonds and then taking the risk of stocks.
Yeah. I was framing that as just sort of an internal belief system, but yes, actually, let's just shift directly to, I'll call out the belief systems that come up, but let's shift directly to a client conversation. I think the conversation has to start with some fundamental principles, making sure we're on the same page. One is that, right? Just the history of returns.
Okay.
And the sort of definition of risk. And that over long periods of time, equities are going to do better than fixed income is going to do better than cash.
And how do you define risk in that context?
Well, I think there's two, and we've got to be really clear that we're talking about the same thing with clients, right? Like,
yeah.
I think most of the people that listen to your podcast and read your material will know this, but many advisors don't, right? They don't know the difference between risk and uncertainty, right? And so the way in sort of our physics MD desire, right? In the academic circles and as practitioners, when we use the word risk, we are saying volatility or standard deviation.
Okay.
Right? We're essentially saying, risk is variability within known bounds.
Okay.
Right? Uncertainty is variability with no known bounds. And what I like, there's so much to cover here, but the short version of it is, I think clients, when they're using the word risk, what they're thinking in their minds is closer to uncertainty. They're thinking like, am I going to end up under the bridge? Right? Is it all going to go away? And we're thinking in this nice, clean little box, like it's a dial, right? Like, oh, well, we'll just turn up the risk. We'll turn down the risk.
Oh, yeah. You don't like this much risk? No problem. I'll just dial you down to a conservative growth portfolio.
Yeah.
And we're thinking in terms of dialing down volatility, and the client's still in the world of, well, if the entire economic system is going to melt down, we're going to go back to the bunker. Not really helping me by being in a conservative growth portfolio, because it still all goes to zero when the system melts down.
That's right. And that does not fit in our model.
And so that's part of why you come back to that assumptions conversation. Like, hey, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Over reasonable periods of time, equities generate more return than fixed income, and fixed income generates more return than cash. Let's just make sure we're on the same page there, because your true bunker level client's going to be like, well, I'm actually not sure.
Yeah, and that would be like, that's okay for them to say that. We just want to understand that's what they're saying. So if they say,
because then at least I know what the conversation. This is not a volatility conversation anymore. This is a, the entire economic system is uncertain for me, not just risky for me, is uncertain for me. I'm not sure history is going to hold.
Yeah, I'm not sure history is going to hold. I don't have faith in the system. Like, so let's just assume, like, I knew that was where you're coming from based on the email before we scheduled this meeting. Okay. I still would have said, hey, I just want to get on the same page and see where we disagree. So just tell me if we're on the same page here. I would outline that history of returns. Like, you could pull out a chart even, and the chart we all use, the mountain graph or whatever. Now, this obviously all assumes that you understand the plan, you understand the goals, the values, like all of that stuff is already done. We don't need to review it. And so now we're just literally having this conversation. You don't have any faith in the economic system. I'm making sure we're talking about the same thing. We look at the mountain chart. Then I say, okay, the second thing we've got to make sure we understand is, I was talking about diversified risk, right? Like, so look, this portfolio, you own 14,000 equities under the hood, like whatever, right? Like, we're not talking about, you understand, you're talking about the whole system here, not an individual company or even a single slice of a specific asset class going to zero. You're talking about the system. Okay, good. We're on the same page, right? So we cover those two, because sometimes people are thinking their neighbor said to them, I invested in the stock market once, or they can even say it more broadly. I don't invest in the market. All my money went to zero. My grandfather lost all his money in the market. And they think, well, the grandfather really lost all of his money because he bet on whatever, XYZ.
Yeah,
stock.
one stock with leverage and got margin squeezed on the way down. And
they are thinking, so we're just, okay, we're on the same page. Great, now let's talk, right? So to operate in the system, we've got to have those fundamental assumptions. And I normally started this conversation by saying, listen, this conversation reminds me a lot. The way we invest money actually reminds me a lot of Winston Churchill's quote about democracy, right? It's the worst form of government ever created by the mind of man, except for all the others. And I feel a little bit like this. I have to tell you, this conversation, the answers I'm going to give you may feel unsatisfactory, right? They may feel like the worst way to invest money, except for all the others. Because at the end, no matter what we do, there's still risk here. And I would also probably point out at this point, like, hey, there's risk in having the money in your mattress. Right? There's fire risk, and there's certainly inflation and cost of living risk, right? So we're just talking about trading risks here. And if you want to go that route under the mattress, we can talk about the most effective way to make sure that, right? Like, what are we going to, so then we get
to, fire insulated apparently.
Yeah, both fire and cost of, and I was thinking more like, what do you want to do? Buy laddered CDs with your $3 million, and we got to talk about FDIC insurance and laddered CDs, and then on top of inflation risk and cost of living, all that stuff. So we're just trading risks around. So let's just get a sense here. So here's the piece we really wanted to get to. That's almost all context for this discussion, which is, look, if we make an assumption other than the ones we've just laid out, right? That here's historical rates of return. We're using the weighty evidence of history to make these decisions overlapped with your goals. And underneath, in terms of how we invest the money, there's this weighty evidence of history, historical returns that we've used to build these portfolios for you. If we start adjusting those, like, my fundamental view is any adjustment to historical returns, in other words, like, we're forecasting something different than historical returns, you've got to have a justification for that. And for those of you out there that feel like you're smart enough to make those forecasts, like, fire away. But just know that once you become the assumer, I've always felt like you better be able to defend that assumption you made. That's a reasonable thing. I never, after looking for 10 years and it being some of the firms with, I would consider, like, at least the firms that were throwing the most resources at those types of people, right? Like, paying them the most to go on TV and wear really nice suits, and seeing that they repeatedly couldn't do it, I just gave up and said, look, I gotta rely on this weighty evidence of history. As soon as we leave that weighty evidence of history, we've got to have a justifiable position. I don't have one. So let's just talk through this. If we decide to go away from that, and this is the exact conversation I probably had this, it wasn't hundreds of times, because I didn't have this many people that were worried, but it was definitely dozens of times. And I've had it more publicly than I have with clients lately, like just maybe people at a Q&A or individual emails. Okay. No, it's just, look, let's assume for a minute that you're right. Like, we have no faith in the system.
Okay.
First of all, we just got to acknowledge that's a big bet, right? Like, that's a bet. And it comes with risk.
And that's literally how you would frame it. Like, that's a bet.
Yeah, that's a bet. I mean, you could say if you want to be gentler, but I don't see any need to be gentle here. But you could say, look, that would be an assumption that we would be making there.
Okay.
Right? And, well, here's the reason. I read this book and I heard this guy, and many of them are really well thought out. There's lots of books right now about the collapse of the whole system, right? So we say, all right, what portfolio would we build? What would be the appropriate portfolio? So this is like, step one is make sure we're on the same page in terms of assumptions. Step two is, okay, let's make sure now we're going to make a set of assumptions / a bet. Step three is build a portfolio that would work in that bet. So, like, what would be, if that was the situation, what would be the appropriate portfolio for that bet? Right? And like, what would be, I always said,
well, like a whole bunch of gold and maybe some Bitcoin, right? I mean, I think to me, that's where you get some of these clients that want to go in this direction of, I think the whole system's going to melt down. I'm afraid the whole system's going to melt down. So, like, I just want to put my money in gold because I read that's the thing that withstands the economic meltdown.
Yeah. So I think that's right. Like, gold, Bitcoin. I used to joke that it was guns and butter. Like, if I was in a bunker, I'd want guns and butter. One of my friends used to say, he always thought it was like things that if things went really bad, you'd want stuff that you could trade with. So he always said cigarettes, and then he was like, and everybody else is going to have gross powdered milk, so I want cocoa, like chocolate milk mix. He's like, I can trade cigarettes and chocolate milk mix with anybody. So, all right, so whatever you think that appropriate portfolio, let's just say guns and butter is like a general term,
sure.
Right? Guns and butter. All right. So then we say, okay, great. Like, that's the portfolio we would build. Bitcoin and gold, guns and butter. And so step 4 would be, okay, let's just look back. Like, what period of time, how often over the last 90 years, and if you want to go further, and I always used 87 because that's how much stock market return like data we had. Where are we now? We've got to be 95, 97, 100 years, something like that. Let's just say 100 years. Out of the last 100 years, what percentage of time would that portfolio have been appropriate? Like, especially if you elongate that like to a 5-year period. Is there a 5-year period? Like, there's probably no 5-year period. I mean, maybe there's one.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So 99% of the time, basically 100% of the time, that portfolio would have been inappropriate over the last 100 years. And so then we're really stuck with, do we really want to gamble that history is going to change that much? Because there's always, right, the 4 words, like, this time it's different.
Yeah. Or just, I saw this article, I saw this video. I mean, what was it? Aftershock, the book and video, was making the rounds a few years ago. You know, what do you do with those clients that just insist, like, but I think the whole system's crashing down. Like, I just want to go get my guns, gold, and butter.
Okay. So I think there's a couple things that are really, really important. One is you've got to figure out where the line is between just talking somebody into this and like the person's literally not going to sleep, right? And I remember, like, your job, at least I view let's just for a minute try to separate any economic impact. I would hope that this goes without saying, any economic impact it has on you, the advisor, this decision, right? Like, and I know it should go without saying, but because we're all human, it doesn't, right? Like, so we try to separate that decision out. We just got to figure out, like, we're pretty clear. I think if you're going to operate in this environment as a planner and advisor, give this kind of advice, you better be pretty clear that this would be a mistake, right? To build a guns and butter portfolio would be a mistake. If you don't think that would be a mistake, that's a whole different discussion.
Okay.
But that's probably a mistake. But if it's going to kill someone, like, if being in the appropriate portfolio, the optimized portfolio, is going to ruin their lives for the next 7 to 10 years because they're so worried, like, our ultimate job is to help somebody understand the trade-offs they're making, and that trade-off would include sleep, right? It would include stress. It doesn't just include optimal portfolio.
And so if they're that anxious, are you letting them go there? Are you helping them go there?
Really, I think this is the huge art to this whole discussion, is the dosage of those things. Like, we joke that it's like the punch in the face versus the empathetic hug. Like, the dosage of those things is really hard because you like, look, I had clients, I can remember clients who were like, just couldn't take it.
Yep.
Just handle it. And so we had to have really hard conversations around, look, I realize this is, and so there's all sorts of phases of that dosage. Like, look, how about, like, one of the conversations I used to have at the end of this, and like, look, so if it's like, here's how this would wrap up: guns and butter portfolio, it's never been appropriate. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So let's say somebody's on the edge and they were still willing to be reasonable, and the way it would end up is like, look, so, and I always tried to make them feel like it was partially their idea as well, and just say, listen, if it's okay, so, and then we circle back to goals. So remember, when we did this weighty evidence of history stuff, when we built the portfolio to give you the highest likelihood of meeting your goals with the lowest risk we could take, not no risk, the lowest risk, we relied on the weighty evidence of history, all the stuff we talked about. Have your goals changed? No. Have your values changed? No. You know, this portfolio is still the right place for you. So if it's okay with you, that was one of my favorite things to say. So if it's okay with you, like, the best advice, and I know this might still feel unsatisfactory, the best advice I can give you is just to stick with it. So, and most of the time, like 97% of the time, people would say, yeah, forget I called, right? Or yeah, good, totally understand it, thanks for the conversation. I had some clients call and say, hey, give me talk number 3, right? Like that talk you give.
Yeah.
then the occasional, let's just for the benefit of people, like the occasional person that says, no, man, it's not okay with me. Right? Or let's say they do that and a week or two later, some bad news comes out and they call and they're just like, I can't take it.
Yep.
Like, what do you do? You know, like, I think in the end, you've got to, like, if you're, if you're,
I mean, what do you do? Are you terminating this client? Are you accommodating this client? Like,
no,
fine, at least let me buy you a gold ETF so you don't just like actually store gold bars in your house. I mean, where do you go with this?
Yeah, no, I think, look, if your advice to a client to help them meet their goals is making the client terribly miserable because of just their own, and I'm using this word carefully, psychosis around these things. I don't mean that terribly negatively. I just mean like they're completely hung up on this and they can't do it. Then you have a couple choices. One, you can I was going to say Nick Murray them, right? Like you could say hit the road. Like I don't like the way I take care of money doesn't work with the way you want your money taken care of. So I therefore cannot charge you anymore because I'm not going to you're not taking my advice. Go on.
And
The other way
and part of the, and it's worth knowing, like, and part of the point of that conversation is it amps up the pressure on the client. Like, okay, so you really want to terminate this relationship? Like, I'm going to fire you as the client if you won't follow my advice, which is a little bit of a high stakes conversation or relationship strategy, but like, it works for some people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to point out. We had a friend of ours point that out recently, that like that threat, like if it sounds like a threat, I would never do it. And I just never realized that it, even if you didn't intend it that way, it could come across sounding like a threat. I would never do it that way. I wouldn't say, look, if you're not going to follow, either you follow my advice or you got to leave. But that's definitely what it sounds like. But the way I would probably say that would be, the way I did say that would be, look, I totally understand this isn't working for you. And it sounds like you've scoped out some options, right? So how do I help you get the money there? Right? So it's much more like, how do I help you? I can remember the guy's name, like without going into last names. His name was Joel. I remember the one client that I lost because of this exact thing was, his name was Joel. And he's like, I just want my money at the bank in CDs. And I went through all of those things. And in the end, I was like, you know what, Joel, this is probably for right now. Now he did this in 2000, late 2009 or something, just before things turned. And obviously this is what I'm talking about, like he regrets it. So there's that option. The other option is you figure out a way where you say, okay, let's dial this return assumption. I'm pulling on a lever. If you can't see it, let's dial this return lever way down. And let's, like, I'm not sure gold and Bitcoin are the right way to do this, but how about laddered treasuries? The US government. Okay, man, we got nothing. Like at some point there may be, but you say, look, why don't we build a portfolio where we're taking huge inflation risk, but you can sleep at night, and that means we need to have some really tough discussions around your goals. And I did have clients that,
because that's part of what it comes back to. Like you really want to step out from participating in the economic system and doing this all in on gold or Bitcoin or whatever it is. Like, okay, I get it. You think this is what holds up if economic Armageddon happens, but like, where do your goals stand if economic Armageddon doesn't happen?
Yeah.
And you just sit out normal economic growth and you're still going.
Yeah, and I think that's another interesting point too. Like, I do remember having this conversation where we're like, look, if the guns and butter portfolio turns out to be the right portfolio, you've got way bigger problems than having a stash of guns and butter, right? Like we're all moving to I remember saying this, we're all moving to the hills and growing our own vegetables. And I don't think your guns are going to help you, or your butter is going to help you all that much, or your pile of gold. What are you going to do? Put it in the wheelbarrow?
Yeah.
So that was that side. The other side is, okay, your goals, if we do this, let's say we build a portfolio of, let's say we build the lowest risk portfolio we possibly could. And by risk, I mean loss of principal, not inflation. Loss of principal, not including inflation, right?
Yeah.
Like just this thing will never go down, then you realize like that means that we're going to have to change goals. And if this is a temporary thing, if somebody said like, oh, that's another part of the early discussion. Is this temporary or permanent? Because, oh, no, I just want to wait till things settle. Well, that's a market timing discussion. That's a whole nother route we have to go down. We're assuming here they've said permanent.
Okay.
Right?
But good thing to clarify, right? Like, are you worried about a temporary meltdown and setback in the economy, or like permanently the whole thing is broken? Because as you know, those are different conversations. If it's temporary, it's like, oh, we're not having a guns and butter discussion. We're having a market timing discussion.
Totally. And we should have nailed that at the beginning. I apologize for missing that, but that's exactly right. Like, so we're assuming they've made a permanent decision. So then we have to say, okay, let's build a portfolio that allows you to sleep at night. And that portfolio looks like laddered US Treasuries and CDs. And if they've got a problem with that, then I don't know what to do. Because I certainly wouldn't facilitate all the way to, unless I believed Bitcoin was a good investment.
Yeah.
And gold was a good investment. I wouldn't facilitate towards speculation that's going to cause me problems later. No way. I would go to the like.
So that's your line of, look, I'll at least accommodate you to government bonds. We got to talk about the trade-offs and the ramifications and such. Like I'll accommodate you to government bonds and laddered CDs. But if you want to go, all in permanent economic meltdown, I just want to be 100% in gold, preferably gold bars in my house. Like that's your kill switch. Like, yeah, this just isn't going to work. Like now you're going to Nick Murray them.
Yeah, I think to me, it would be the decision would be around, it's an asset class that I use and believe in. Right. Like, and I use fixed income in portfolios. We're just saying, look, we're going to use them a little bit more and slightly different than we have in the past. And that would probably be like individual securities that are laddered with some sort of form of guarantee, FDIC insurance or backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. And if you say, well, and then you have to point out, like in a full economic meltdown, is the full faith and credit of the US government still going to apply in a full meltdown with you, Mr. or Mrs. Client? No, I don't know what to do. Yeah. I just literally don't know what to do at that point. Because if you bring on guns gold and Bitcoin, now you've got a speculative portfolio that puts you in a world of regulatory risk, right? Like if that goes south, try explaining that to someone.
Yeah.
Right? Because no one really understands that stuff. It's pretty easy for a client to say, I didn't understand what I was saying.
Yeah.
So that would be my line of like, look, and then let's say that, okay, yeah, Treasury CDs, we come up with a compromise. Cool. Let's talk about your goals now. And some clients are going to be okay. Like I can remember a couple clients that were like, we just had 80% in fixed income, 20% in equity, and there's no concerns.
But I think to me, like the three interesting takeaways around this conversation and sort of just setting it up or trying to get through it with the client. Number one is just clarifying, like, are we on the same page about the assumptions and sort of principles of markets? Like, over reasonable periods of time, equities grow more than fixed income and fixed income yields more than cash. Like, are we on the same page here? Because if we're not, like, the whole economic system is breaking. So I need to know if we're having an economic system is breaking conversation or just a, like, I'm nervous about returns conversation. Yeah. The second is this kind of, are we talking about something temporary? Are we talking about something permanent? Because if it's permanent, we're back to the system is breaking conversation. If it's temporary, this is actually a market timing conversation in disguise. So I need to do that conversation. And then number three is this piece of just walking clients through how this plays out. Like, how much of a bet do you want to make on this, world economic meltdown disaster system, recognizing that if that's the bet you make and you make it with all or most of your money and the world doesn't end and the darn system just keeps chugging along and growing, like, are you actually going to ruin your goals in the normal scenario because you bet on the end of the world and the world didn't end? And so at least helping to walk people through, like, have you really just thought about how this plays out? Like, you want guns, you actually know how to shoot them? Like, you want gold. How are you going to cut the gold to trade when you got to hand it off to someone for food in economic Armageddon? Like, do you have a metal slicer? How are you going to do this? And just trying to get them to true up that realization and at least own it if they're going to do it, or maybe realize that it doesn't quite make sense even what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think the trick to all of this is just figuring out where because you could very easily stop the discussion if you don't have agreement on the fundamental assumptions around how the economic system works. You may just say that's like having an argument about the fact that a hammer won't pound a nail, right? Like, I'm a carpenter, you don't think a hammer will pound a nail. I can't help you build your house. Right? Like, it's just, and it's not because you're bad, I'm good. And it's just because like you're saying the fundamental tools I use, you have doubt about them. I understand that. It means it's not a good fit. You and I are not a good fit, right?
And that's where it ends. Like, that's sort of the penultimate Nick Murray moment. Like, look, if we can't get on the same page about this stuff, like, we're just gonna have to stop working together.
How else do you? I mean, we could think of so many analogies, like the doctor saying, "Look, I argue that medicine will not work," and you're the doctor saying, "Here's the medicine.
Yeah,
I've done research, I've treated. I don't think that medicine works." Okay, I can't really help you. Now, the one change I would make, and I feel bad about saying it, Nick, like, and I love the way Nick Murray handles things, where he's just really clear, is awesome, and it works great for many people. Like, I was a little gentler, right? Like, and so I think it's more like, hey, I now clearly understand where you're coming from, Mr. and Mrs. Client. I'm not saying I agree. I'm just saying I clearly understand.
Yep.
I understand how hard it would be to make financial decisions with that set of beliefs that you've got, but it's clearly incompatible with the work that I do. And so it's just not a good fit for us. So it wouldn't be like, if you don't come around to my belief system, I'm firing you. It would be more like, look, it's just incompatible. Because I don't know that I would want to talk, depending on how far you got in this conversation, I don't know that I would want the relationship, and I don't mean legal risk, I just mean like the stress myself.
Yeah.
Like, if something did go, like if you have another financial crisis and remember, you talk them into a 60% equity portfolio, right? Like, that matches their goals, and they say yes, and you've got an 18-month, or heaven forbid, a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, which we're already forgetting can happen. You got to look them in the eyes when their portfolio is down. You know, the equity markets are down 50%, so their portfolio is down 34% or 30%. You got to look them in the eyes and they go, "I told you, this is what I'm talking about. I'm not sleeping." And you've got to be the one. Like, I wouldn't want that. And I just wouldn't want the stress risk in my own life.
Yeah. All right. So start with principles of returns. Is this a temporary or permanent problem? How much of a bet do you really want to make? And your Hail Mary passes to Nick Murray them at the end.
Well, yeah, and the bunker just outline up the bunker portfolio. What percentage of time would this be good? Okay, do we really want to make that bet? Right? And then clearly what this does to the overall plan. And I'm moving my hands as a lever again, right? Yeah. I think sometimes we get caught up and we got to talk people into that there's only one lever. Because the more subtle version of this is like, I'm just uncomfortable with the level of risk.
Yeah.
Well, and it's kind of the same principles. It's just that we're going beyond zero, right? Yeah. Like, it's okay to take a client to 40% fixed income if that's what would help the goals they're willing to take and the trade-offs they're willing to make. We can adjust their spending. We can have them die. Like, that one's a joke, but right. So we've got other levers to pull on. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. That's a complicated problem. And let me just mention one thing. Like, internally, I've had this conversation more with other financial advisors than I have with clients. And it may be the nature of the work I do now, but I think a lot of us wonder, like, can I handle the next shoe dropping?
Yeah.
And I think you go through that was exactly the same set of conversations I would take myself through.
Yep.
If I no longer fundamentally believe in that system, it's pretty darn hard to be an advisor. You know?
Well, thank you, Carl.
My pleasure.
Conversation. Thank you for joining me on our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.